Benjamin was a young art student, passionate about what he did, who had just moved into a new apartment in the city. It was small and on the first floor, but it suited his purposes, giving him freedom for his studies and privacy, since he was going to live there alone. The first day he arrived, he noticed a large, strange painting hanging on the living room wall, its gold-painted edges drawing a lot of attention as the first object you would look at when entering the room. He analyzed every aspect of the frame, admiring a work that you wouldn't see just anywhere. The painting showed a figure, a human silhouette obscured in the middle of a misty forest. There was something unsettling about the way the tree branches intertwined around the figure. In the evening, after settling into his room, Ben heard strange noises coming from the living room, and as he went closer to check, the moonlight through the window revealed that the figure in the painting was in a different position from when he had first seen it, as if it were closer to the edge, and the branches that had previously intertwined seemed to be further apart. Ben tried to rationalize it, thinking it was just a figment of his tired imagination after the long move. But over the next few days, strange events began to disturb his days and nights in this new apartment. He felt like he was being watched, even though he was alone. And the figure in the painting seemed closer and closer to the edges, almost wanting to leave his space. One day, after returning from a job at college, Ben found all the furniture in the living room turned upside down and broken. There had been a real mess in his apartment. At first glance, he thought he had been the victim of a burglary in his home, but one thing caught his eye: the painting was intact, and now the figure had completely disappeared from inside the frame. He heard a noise coming from the floor, and began to search for the source until he found a door leading to the basement, which he had never noticed before. As he descended the creaking stairs, he found a wooden door at the bottom. When he unlocked it, he was confronted with something that left him haunted forever. As the days went by, Benjamin became more and more paranoid and suspicious of everyone around him, having nightmares every night that led to sleepless nights. Until a neighbor, Mrs. Stacy, concerned about his screams over the last few nights, confronted him and asked what was going on in that apartment. He then burst into tears and told her the whole terrible story. He had seen the figure in the painting through that door in the basement. Ben said he didn't know what was real anymore. Mrs. Stacy listened with concern as the boy recounted the terrible events that had tormented him. At first, she was skeptical, but seeing how upset the young man seemed, she began to believe that something strange really was going on down there. She insisted that he spend the night in her apartment upstairs, so that he could rest. But the nightmares only got worse, with visions of that entity from the painting dragging him out of his apartment into the darkness. When the young man woke up in the middle of the night screaming in a cold sweat, Mrs. Stacy saw the true terror in his eyes. The next day, after a long conversation, Mrs. Stacy decided to help Ben, and so they decided to face whatever was haunting the place. With distress, they went to the young man's apartment towards the basement door. All was quiet when they got downstairs, until they heard a noise as if something was scratching the wall non-stop in their direction. Mrs. Stacy shone her flashlight from her cell phone and screamed at the scene. What they saw was disturbing. Hanging on the wall was a large, human-shaped creature with gray, wrinkled skin stuck to its bones, very thin. But the face seemed to be screaming in eternal agony. It was the figure from the painting. As they recoiled in horror, a hoarse scream echoed around them. A shadow loomed out of the darkness. The thing was thirsting for Ben's life and had found a new victim, his neighbor. The shadow moved quickly through the darkness of the basement and the hoarse scream ceased, while Ben and Mrs. Stacy could only hear their own footsteps, trying to get out of the basement that seemed miles long. Suddenly, a loud noise made them stop running, and then hoarse breathing could be heard close to their necks. Slowly they turned around with the flashlights and shone them on the entity from hell. A hoarse scream came out of its disfigured mouth before it attacked and tore the skin from Mrs. Stacy's arm. The creature had huge claws in place of its fingers. Ben pushed Mrs. Stacy aside to protect her, and the two of them started running up the stairs while the entity ran after them in a bizarre way. They managed to close the door in front of the creature, preventing it from getting out. Then hoarse screams of agony echoed through the apartment. Darkness enveloped the entire residence. They couldn't see an inch in front of them. Ben called out for Mrs. Stacy, but she didn't answer. He kept calling until he realized that his voice was getting hoarse with each scream. Other neighbors heard the screams and called the police. A few minutes later, they broke down the door to Ben's apartment and found a home that had been torn apart. In the living room they found Mrs. Stacy in front of the picture frame, completely torn apart on the floor, with several extensive and deep cuts all over her body, almost leaving her unrecognizable. The student, on the other hand, has disappeared, and all that remains is the picture on the wall, with the entity back in its original position, but this time with a human face, Ben's face, distorted and with its mouth open in agony. Benjamin became the main suspect in Mrs. Stacy's death, a crime he didn't commit, and now he had no voice to shout the truth, trapped forever in the work of art, trapped in what he loved. See you in the next video.